February 20th, 1943. North of Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The official battle reports would never capture what German tank commanders saw that morning. Through the haze of dust and smoke, American Sherman tanks performed maneuvers that seemed impossible under Wehrmacht doctrine. 5 Shermans, separated by broken terrain and unable to see each other, suddenly converged on German positions with flawless timing. There were no signal flags, no flares, no dispatch riders racing between vehicles. Yet the Shermans moved like one body, each tank protecting the other's blind spots, each crew somehow aware of where their comrades were. Inside Panzer IVs equipped with Fug 5 radios, German commanders fought their own battle against static-filled transmissions. Their amplitude modulation sets, considered advanced in the 1930s, barely worked once the tanks began moving. 10-watt transmitters could only reach a few hundred meters, and most panzers carried receivers only. They could listen to orders, but they couldn't report what they saw or call for help. The Americans, on the other hand, were using a technology the Germans didn't even know existed: frequency modulation radios. Every Sherman carried one. With crystal-controlled precision, 25 watts of transmission power, and unmatched clarity, their voices cut cleanly through the roar of engines and battlefield chaos. From Detroit's factories, 8,000 miles from Tunisia, the most decisive technological advantage of World War II had arrived. Not thicker armor, not bigger guns, but invisible electromagnetic waves that linked every American tank into something the Wehrmacht never imagined possible: a true battlefield network. This revolution began on July 22, 1941. When the U.S. Army standardized 3 new radio sets for all medium tanks: the SCR-508, SCR-528, and SCR-538. At the same time, German forces were storming into the Soviet Union, relying heavily on AM radios for command vehicles. American engineers at the Galvin Manufacturing Company, soon to be known as Motorola, were perfecting FM technology that would render German sets obsolete. The team included Daniel E. Noble, who envisioned FM for military use, and Henryk Magnutsky, the lead RF engineer who solved the enormous challenge of installing complex electronics inside a tank. Their creation weighed 181 pounds, but transformed every Sherman into part of the world's first battlefield-wide communication network.
The BC-604 transmitter put out 25 watts of power, 2.5 times that of Germany's Fug 5. It operated in the 20.0 to 27.9 megahertz range, with 10 crystal-controlled channels that stayed stable even under combat conditions. The SCR-508 carried dual BC-603 receivers, letting commanders monitor 2 frequencies at once, for example, their platoon channel and the company command channel, giving them a decisive edge. But the true breakthrough lay in FM itself. Edwin Armstrong's frequency modulation eliminated the static and interference that crippled AM radios. German tank crews heard every spark plug, every electrical discharge, every motor as noise. American crews, by contrast, heard crystal-clear voices, even during artillery barrages. On November 8, 1942, during Operation Torch, U.S. armored units landed in North Africa with SCR-508 radios already installed. Soon, the Wehrmacht's most experienced armored force, the Afrika Korps, would learn what they were up against: tanks that could talk to each other with flawless clarity across distances and conditions that left German radios useless. The Germans were about to discover just how dangerous this new technology could be. A typical German tank platoon had 5 vehicles. Out of those, only 1 or 2 carried a full Fug 5, capable of both sending and receiving. The rest were equipped with the simpler Fug 2, which could only listen. They heard orders, but they couldn't respond or report enemy positions. This system forced German tanks into a rigid hierarchy. Orders came from the platoon leader, and subordinate tanks acknowledged only through their movements, not their voices. Command tanks were easy targets, identified by their multiple antennas. Once those were destroyed, the entire platoon often fell apart, unable to coordinate. Against the Americans, this weakness was devastating. Every Sherman carried a full transmitter. Any tank could assume command instantly if needed. The difference became clear during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, February 14th to 24th, 1943. Although the engagement was, on paper, a German victory, it revealed something far more important: American radio superiority. Even amid chaos, scattered units of the 1st Armored Division kept coordination over 50 miles of battlefield. Tank crews who had never even met before could still work together, warning each other of threats, calling artillery support, and planning counterattacks, all through crystal-clear FM communication. German intelligence listened in and were stunned. Reports noted the exceptional clarity of American signals and their ability to maintain contact at ranges where German radios delivered
nothing but static. Even more alarming, it appeared that every American tank could transmit, not just the command vehicles. The FUG-5 radios in German panzers operated in the 27.0 to 33.3 MHz range, using AM. Their 10-watt transmitters worked only 2 to 3 kilometers in ideal conditions, and far less when tanks were moving. Every engine spark, every electrical motor, every turning track created interference AM could not filter out. By contrast, the American SCR-508's FM clarity sliced through the noise. The Germans were facing an enemy that wasn't just shooting at them, they were out-communicating them. When the Allies invaded Italy in September 1943, many expected the mountainous terrain to cripple U.S. radios. The opposite happened. FM proved even more reliable than AM in difficult landscapes. American tanks could coordinate through valleys and across ridge lines where German signals simply died out. Reports from the U.S. 1st Armored Division described routine coordination at distances where German tanks could hear only static. Tank platoons separated by ridge lines could launch synchronized attacks as if they were side by side. To German commanders, this seemed impossible, yet they saw it happening again and again. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. As Sherman tanks rolled off the landing craft at Normandy, their SCR-508 radios kept them in contact not only with each other, but also with naval fire support offshore. Coordination the Germans could not hope to match. But the Normandy hedgerows exposed a new problem. Tank radios could not talk directly to infantry radios. The Shermans operated in the 20.0 to 27.9 MHz range, while infantry used the SCR-300 walkie-talkies in the 40.0 to 48.0 MHz band. This gap proved deadly. In the bocage, German infantry with Panzerfausts could ambush tanks at close range. Sometimes American infantry saw them, but had no way to warn their tank support. The U.S. Army quickly improvised. Within weeks, tank crews mounted EE-8 field telephones in ammo boxes welded to their hulls, connected by wire directly into the tank's intercom. By Operation Cobra in late July 1944, this simple fix transformed tank infantry coordination. From July 25th to 30th, 1944, during Operation Cobra, American radio power reached its peak. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division under Major General Edward H. Brooks coordinated over 200 Sherman tanks using a seamless radio network. German defenders of the Panzer Lehr Division faced an enemy that seemed to have supernatural awareness.
Shermans reacted to threats reported miles away. Artillery strikes landed within minutes of being requested. German tanks, by comparison, struggled to even signal to one another. Most had no working radios, and those that did were crippled by interference and limited range. The irony could not have been sharper. Germany had pioneered radios in tanks. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, had demanded radio equipment in armored forces since the 1920s. His 1937 book, Achtung Panzer, emphasized communication as the key to armored warfare. But by 1943, German industry could not keep up. Out of roughly 5,700 medium tanks built that year, fewer than 2,000 FUG transceivers were produced. Radios were prioritized for command tanks and assault guns, leaving most vehicles mute. Even the Soviet Union was worse off. Their most famous tank, the T-34, was often built without radios at all. Soviet doctrine relied on flags and pre-battle planning, with disastrous results. By 1941, German forces slaughtered Soviet tank units that had no way to coordinate in battle. By 1943, U.S. Lend-Lease shipments gave some Soviet tanks American SCR-508 radios. Still, by war's end, only about 25% of Soviet tanks had radios. The Americans had achieved what no one else had: 100% deployment. Every Sherman had an FM radio. But even after Normandy, the deadliest battles were still to come. At Kasserine Pass in 1943, this difference became painfully clear. German panzer commanders, relying on outdated AM sets, fought not just the Americans, but their own radios. Orders were missed. Reinforcements never arrived. Entire units moved blindly. By contrast, Sherman crews could coordinate with a precision the Wehrmacht had never encountered. Tank platoons acted like living organisms, shifting, flanking, and concentrating fire as if controlled by a single mind. The German FUG-5 transmitter, with its fragile tuning dials and unstable frequency drift, was useless once the tank engines roared. Static, overwhelmed voices. Commanders often had to stop moving, shut down engines, and then attempt to transmit, a death sentence in the middle of combat. The American SCR-508, however, worked flawlessly even at full throttle. The FM signal ignored electrical noise. It ignored atmospheric crackle. Crews could drive, fire, and talk at the same time. This advantage went far beyond tank-to-tank coordination. With dual receiver sets, American commanders could hear higher-level orders and still stay in constant touch with their men. In practice, this meant that every platoon could adapt instantly to new situations, whether shifting to cover infantry, holding a defensive line, or launching a sudden assault.
German armored doctrine had always relied on a rigid chain of command. Orders flowed downward, often delayed, and rarely adjusted once given. The Americans, empowered by FM radios, fought with a fluidity that the Wehrmacht simply couldn't match. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, quickly realized what was happening. He later wrote that German armored forces were deaf and blind compared to the Americans, who seemed able to react to battlefield changes almost instantly. By 1943, the tactical balance in North Africa had shifted. Not because the Sherman was better armed or armored. In fact, against the Panzer IV and later Tigers, it was often outgunned. But communication turned the tide. What the Sherman lacked in firepower, it made up for with coordination. When American tank units advanced, they did so in perfectly timed waves. When they withdrew, it was orderly and cohesive. When they attacked, every gun in the platoon could be brought to bear on a single target in seconds. For the Germans, this was not just frustrating, it was devastating. Their own units, scattered and poorly connected, found themselves isolated and destroyed piecemeal. The seeds of a new style of warfare had been planted. A war where information, the ability to communicate instantly and clearly, mattered as much as steel and firepower. By late 1943, German High Command knew they had a problem. Reports from the front described American radio discipline as superior, their signals clear and reliable, and their units capable of executing maneuvers that should have been impossible. But by then, it was already too late. The Wehrmacht was locked into AM technology.
Upgrading thousands of tanks to FM was impossible in the middle of a global war. German industry was already stretched to its limits, producing weapons, vehicles, and ammunition. There was no capacity to design, test, and deploy an entirely new communications system. The Americans, meanwhile, were producing hundreds of thousands of FM radios, installing them not only in tanks, but in half-tracks, artillery units, and command posts. By the time the Allies landed in Italy and later in Normandy, this invisible network had become one of their most powerful weapons.
By the time Allied forces pushed into Italy in 1943, the communication gap had widened even further. American tanks rolled ashore already linked into a network that spanned platoons, companies, and battalions. Orders could be given on the move. Enemy positions could be reported instantly. Fire support could be called in without delay. For German units defending the rugged Italian terrain, the experience was bewildering. They faced an opponent that seemed to coordinate effortlessly, shifting armor to wherever the pressure was greatest. Even when ambushed, American units recovered with shocking speed, regrouping under fire and counterattacking before German forces could exploit their advantage. The explanation was simple. American tankers weren't fighting as individuals. They were fighting as a system, one that shared information in real time. This became even clearer during the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944. On D-Day, as thousands of men stormed the beaches, Sherman tanks equipped with SCR-508 FM radios provided direct, reliable communication not only with each other, but also with infantry commanders, artillery observers, and naval gunfire control teams offshore. The result was unprecedented coordination. When German strongpoints resisted, tanks and infantry worked in seamless partnership. When enemy armor appeared, American units concentrated fire instantly, overwhelming isolated panzers. German commanders were stunned. Their own units, often cut off by Allied bombing and naval gunfire, struggled to get even the most basic orders through. Radio silence, interference, and equipment failures left them operating in the dark. The Fug-5, once the pride of the panzer divisions, had become a liability. In the hedgerows of Normandy, its short range and constant static turned German armored units into disconnected fragments, unable to support one another. Meanwhile, American forces advanced using a fluid, almost organic style of warfare. Platoons adjusted on the fly. Companies coordinated across terrain that should have broken communication. Artillery and air support were brought to bear with astonishing precision. The difference was so dramatic that German officers began to comment on it openly in captured reports. Some even admitted that American tank radios were the best weapon they possessed. For the Allies, FM radios had become more than just equipment. They were a force multiplier, amplifying every other strength. For the Germans, the lack of such technology was a silent weakness that no amount of tactical skill or battlefield courage could overcome.
By late 1944, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, the Wehrmacht's armored units were shadows of their former selves. Their tanks were still formidable, their crews still skilled, but without reliable communication, they were fighting blind. And blind armies cannot win modern wars. December 1944, the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last great gamble in the West. Hundreds of German tanks, including powerful Panthers and Tigers, poured into the snowy forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. At first, the surprise attack worked. American lines buckled. Entire units were forced to retreat. But soon, the same invisible weapon that had carried the U.S. Army through North Africa, Italy, and Normandy turned the tide once again. Sherman commanders linked by SCR-508 radios coordinated defensive actions with speed the Germans couldn't match. Tank destroyer battalions were guided into ambush positions. Artillery batteries shifted fire within minutes. Infantry and armor reinforced one another in real time. German crews, by contrast, often fought in isolation. A Tiger or Panther might crush an American position, only to be destroyed minutes later because reinforcements didn't know where it was, or because infantry support never arrived. Orders bogged down in confusion, lost in static, or delayed until they no longer mattered. The Wehrmacht's reliance on AM technology had trapped it in the past. This weakness was not confined to the Western Front. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces also exploited the communication gap. By 1944, Red Army tank units were receiving Lend-Lease Shermans equipped with FM radios. These stood in stark contrast to the Soviet T-34s, many of which still lacked radios altogether, forcing crews to rely on flags and hand signals. The Soviets quickly saw the advantage. Shermans in Soviet service often led armored columns precisely because their radios allowed for organized maneuvers that T-34s could not replicate. For German forces already facing overwhelming Soviet numbers, the realization was grim. They were being outcommunicated as well as outproduced. By 1945, the consequences were unmistakable. The Wehrmacht, once feared for its blitzkrieg tactics, was reduced to fragmented counterattacks and desperate defenses. Its armored spearheads no longer struck with coordinated precision. Instead, they stumbled forward in pieces, unable to concentrate strength where it mattered most. The Allies, by contrast, advanced as a unified machine. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft were linked in ways the Germans could only imagine. What had begun as a technical decision back in July 1941 to adopt FM radios for every tank had reshaped the entire war. When the Third Reich finally collapsed in May 1945, it wasn't just because of Allied numbers, industry, or strategy. It was also because the Germans had lost the battle for communication, the most silent yet most decisive battlefield of all.
When the war ended in May 1945, the battlefields of Europe were littered with the wreckage of tanks. Shermans, Panzers, T-34s, steel monuments to a conflict that had reshaped the world. But among those hulks of twisted armor lay a truth invisible to the naked eye. The war had not only been won with guns and engines, but with voices carried through the air. The Allies had proven that information was as powerful as firepower. In every major campaign, from North Africa to Normandy, from the Ardennes to the Rhine, the side that communicated more clearly and more reliably had prevailed. FM radios had turned American tank units into flexible, coordinated forces, while German reliance on outdated AM systems left their armored spearheads scattered and blind. The lesson was not lost on military planners. In the immediate aftermath of the war, NATO forces standardized FM communication across all armored units, ensuring that never again would Western armies fight with the chaos of static-filled orders and isolated units. The SCR-508 became the foundation of modern battlefield communication, influencing the next generation of radios used in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. For the Germans, the story was a harsh reminder of how innovation can be lost to rigid thinking. The Wehrmacht had pioneered combined arms tactics in the 1930s, yet failed to adapt when a new technology, frequency modulation, rendered their systems obsolete. Their tanks were powerful, their crews skilled, but without reliable radios, even the mightiest Tiger could be cut down by a coordinated swarm of Shermans. In the decades that followed, the invisible battlefield only grew more important. Radios evolved into encrypted systems. Satellites expanded communication to a global scale, and eventually digital networks linked entire armies. Yet the principle remained the same. The force that communicates best wins. Looking back, it is striking to realize that the most decisive weapon of World War II was not forged from steel or explosives. It was born in laboratories, crafted by engineers like Edwin Armstrong, Daniel Noble, and Henryk Magnuski, who saw that clarity of voice could mean clarity of victory. For the men inside Sherman tanks, those radios were lifelines, connecting them to their comrades, their commanders, and their mission. For their enemies, they were an unseen adversary, tilting battles before the first shot was even fired. The world remembers Normandy, El Alamein, and the Ardennes as battles of tanks, planes, and infantry. But behind every advance, behind every coordinated maneuver, was a silent current of electromagnetic waves binding the Allied war machine together. In the end, victory in World War II was carried not only by steel treads and cannon fire, but by the invisible voices that traveled through the air, unbroken, unstoppable, and clear.